The subcommittee will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to review the Coast Guard's major acquisitions programs. The Coast Guard's effort to recapitalize its aircraft, vessels, and communication systems has suffered through some dark days. Fortunately, under the leadership of Admiral Papp and his predecessor, Admiral Allen, the program has turned the corner, and the service is finally taking delivery of new and improved assets in a cost-effective manner. Unfortunately, just as the men and women of the Coast Guard are finally getting the new and improved assets promised to them nearly 20 years ago, the President is proposing a budget that will set the program back another 15 to 20 years. The President guts the Coast Guard's acquisition budget, cutting it by 42% below the current level. The President's request proposes to terminate or delay the acquisition of critically needed replacement assets. This will increase acquisition costs for taxpayers, place further strain on the service's aging and failing legacy assets, exacerbate growing capability gaps, and seriously degrade mission effectiveness. As this subcommittee has continually highlighted, the Coast Guard currently operates 10 and in some cases hundreds of thousands of hours short of its operational targets. This means assets are not there for the service to conduct drug and migrant interdiction, protect our environment, secure our ports, or ensure the safety of our waterways. For instance, the Coast Guard reported that due largely to its failing legacy assets, it was forced to reduce hours spent conducting drug interdiction activities by 65% in recent fiscal years. The only way to reverse the decline in the Coast Guard's mission performance is to make the necessary investments to acquire new and improved assets. Unfortunately, based on the last couple of budget requests, it appears this administration refuses to make those investments. If that is the case, then it is time for the President to tell Congress what missions the Coast Guard will no longer conduct. It is simply irresponsible to continue to send our servicemen and women out on failing legacy assets commissioned over 50 years ago and expect them to succeed in their missions. I thank the witness for appearing today and look forward to your testimony. With that, I yield to Ranking Member Garamendi.
Thank you, Chairman Hunter, and to all the witnesses that are appearing today, thank you very much for the testimony that you will soon be giving us. As we turn our attention this morning to focus once again on the status of the Coast Guard's long-range program to recapitalize its aging fleets of surface ships and aircraft and to improve its communications and intelligence technology for the 21st century, we're keeping in mind the extraordinary budget challenges that we are facing. It's not just the administration, it's this Congress as well. As we discovered during the subcommittee's April 16th hearing concerning the administration's fiscal year 2014 budget request for the Coast Guard, we are simply not providing the Coast Guard with the resources it needs to fulfill its many missions. Failing that, it's folly for us to believe the Coast Guard will be able to adequately maintain operations and, importantly, sustain the progress in its $29 billion recapitalization strategy, the largest such initiative the Coast Guard's storied history. So the predicament we find ourselves in is not entirely the Coast Guard's making, nor can it be attributed to any one factor. And as you, Admiral Currier, will soon be testifying, at least from your written testimony, the Coast Guard is doing its utmost to wisely utilize the resources that are appropriated by this Congress to address the most pressing problems and priorities that you have. But the fact remains, if we continue on the same course, we will accomplish little but to hollow out the capabilities of our guardians of the sea. And the warning signals are there. We're approaching that tipping point, and it's abundantly clear. Fiscal year 2014 budget requests for the Acquisition Construction Improvement Account is only $909 million. This is $600 million less than the funding levels authorized in last year's Coast Guard Maritime Transportation Act and $1.1 billion less than the $2 billion funding level recommended for the ACI account by the Navy League of the United States in the 2013 Maritime Policy Statement. Additionally, we're seeing certain acquisition programs prematurely terminated, and the timetables for other programs pushed further into the future. Moreover, the Coast Guard now faces an imminent gap in operational capability as its aging legacy assets are pressed far beyond their service life. The new assets are going to be very late in arrival. Mr. Chairman, it's a very important hearing. I thank you for calling it. We have a lot of work to do. I look forward to the testimony, and I look forward to avoiding the hollowing out of the Coast Guard. I thank you. Yield back.
Thank the ranking member. Our first panel is one witness, Vice Admiral John Currier, Vice Commandant of the United States Coast Guard. Admiral, you're recognized for your statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Garamendi, other members of the panel, I ask that my written testimony be entered into the record. Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, members of the subcommittee, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today. In our mission set, our men and women are amongst the most dedicated, well-trained, and highly skilled in the world, and we owe them our very best efforts to continue to provide the support and the tools they need to execute maritime governance and sovereignty for our nation. Not only do we owe men and women of the Coast Guard the tools they need to do their job, we owe them an environment of trust, and I'd like to take 1 minute just to talk about that. We have respect, we have core values, but most important, we have trust in our workforce. In our business, trust is a priceless attribute. I can tell you from years past, being a helicopter pilot, that the trust that the crew holds when you're out on a hazardous mission is absolutely priceless, and it's essential to the accomplishment of the mission. When it comes to sexual assault, an issue that's received a lot of attention of late, we've been working this issue for a long time. It is a matter of trust in our workforce. I want to take the opportunity to assure you that the Commandant and I are wholeheartedly committed to eliminating the crime of sexual assault from the Coast Guard. It is our #1 priority. But I know we're here today to talk about acquisition. Let me start by thanking you for the stalwart support of this subcommittee for our service and the accomplishments of our mission. The oversight and advocacy from this subcommittee has been essential to the remarkable progress we have made in our recapitalization efforts to date. The Coast Guard remains committed to sustaining our most critical frontline operations while funding our most needed acquisition projects. In the current fiscal environment, this requires difficult choices. With that in mind, we are balancing funding for our acquisition projects and operating budgets to address our highest strategic priorities and the areas we see as greatest risk. Our motivated men and women are already seeing the tangible benefits of our capabilities that have been introduced to the fleet through our recapitalization programs. A case in point, recently, the crew of the Coast Guard cutter Berthoff employed a ship-based unmanned aerial vehicle to support the interdiction of a go-fast smuggling vessel. Berthoff's crew orchestrated a seamless aerial surveillance that involved MPA fixed-wing aircraft, a ScanEagle UAS that was undergoing prototype testing, handed off to an armed helicopter, who handed off to a long-range interceptor, who actually did the stop, the arrest, and the interdiction, ended up yielding 600 kilos of virgin cocaine. This is exactly how the system should work, and we're very gratified to see this. The level of interoperability was simply not available with our legacy assets. It demonstrates how we apply these updated capabilities to defeat the threats in the offshore environment. And I would underscore the offshore environment is our area of greatest risk. A key element to our layered security regime is persistent presence in the offshore to deter, detect, to interdict, and to neutralize threats before they reach our shorelines. Completing acquisition of the national security cutters and development of an affordable offshore patrol cutter fleet are critical to the Coast Guard's continued ability to address threats and protect national interests in the offshore maritime environment. Our mission set can be particularly challenging in some of the harsh environmental conditions in which we operate. Often the question can be asked, if not the Coast Guard, then who? We continue to enhance efficiency across the acquisition portfolio, building on our previous experience and incorporating lessons learned to minimize risk and maximize the affordability in our projects. We have achieved stability in cost and schedule across our largest programs, as evidenced by the recent fixed-price production contract on the 6th National Security Cutter, which was awarded at near the same price as NSCs 4 and 5. This underscores the benefits of predictable funding and timely contract award. The on-time delivery of our 6 fast response cutters, which are already successfully in service in the 7th District of the Miami Caribbean AOR, is further testament to our focus on implementing best practices across the acquisition portfolio. In the aviation fleet, we've recently accepted the 15th Maritime Patrol aircraft, the HC-144, on budget and on schedule. We continue to sustain and upgrade the legacy rotary wing fleet with critical system enhancements that will equip air crews with the capabilities necessary to execute our missions for the next decade plus. Should they become available, we're very excited and poised to accept up to 21 C-27J aircraft from the Air Force. The business case for assimilating these aircraft into the Coast Guard inventory is strong, with a potential of $500 to $800 million in cost avoidance, depending on how many airframes are made available. We recently completed the rollout of the Rescue 21 communications system along our Atlantic, Pacific, and Gulf coasts, as well as the Great Lakes, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. This provides digital selective calling and a digitally based communication system that includes radio signal location information for over 41,000 miles of our U.S. coastline. We are leveraging Rescue 21 capabilities to develop a system specifically tailored to the unique requirements of Alaska and our inland Western River system. The Coast Guard recently reached the milestone of 50,000 search and rescue cases using the Rescue 21 capability. We continue to improve and standardize our small boat fleet through the delivery of the Response Boat Medium and Response Boat Small, and delivery of our new standard over-the-horizon 4 or OTH Class 4 cutter boat. As a common boat deployed on all our cutters larger than the 110-foot patrol boat, our strategy is to limit our shipborne small boat assets to 2, a 7-meter and an 11-meter rib for standardization and universal use across the cutter classes. I'm very proud of the work of our acquisition professionals. They perform hard work and thankless work often on each day to efficiently acquire the assets and capabilities we need to serve the nation. We continue to work hard to make necessary reforms and realize efficiencies within the acquisition programs. Despite the significant challenges, we must continue to work the work we started on acquisition and mission support reform and keep our eyes fixed on the horizon. Our goal, which was set in 2006, was to become a model mid-sized Federal agency for acquisition process and results, and I truly believe we've achieved that goal. I believe that with predictable funding, we can acquire these needed capabilities efficiently. Your support and predictable funding of these projects is absolutely critical. Clearly, we have to make difficult decisions moving forward in this environment. We'll continue to make the best use of our resources and abilities to provide safe and effective conduct of operations in the areas that we see of greatest risk to the nation. To the best of our ability, we'll recapitalize our cutters, boats, and aircraft to address current and emerging threats, particularly in the area of greatest risk capabilities-wise, as I said, in the offshore environment. Thank you again, sir, for the opportunity to testify today, and thank you for your steadfast support of our Coast Guard. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Admiral, for your testimony. We're now going to recognize members for questions, starting with myself. This subcommittee, I know before I came here, the previous chairman, Chairman Lobiando, we've had hearings about deep water and about the acquisition system for years now, about the deplorable state of Coast Guard legacy assets, the negative impact that those old assets and the inability to recapitalize them has had on performance. The Inspector General, the GAO, and the Coast Guard have all testified over the last few years that the continued reliance on aging and failing legacy assets is robbing the Coast Guard of its ability to conduct its 11 statutory missions. The Commandant has testified that the service needs over $2 billion annually to rebuild its assets, to recapitalize. Over the last decade, Congress has worked closely with each administration to increase annual funding for the acquisition program in an effort to reach that goal, even working through the problems after Deepwater, getting those straightened out and saying, okay, now we have a good way ahead. Unfortunately now, this year, as we're finally, I would say, on a nice flat plane, making progress, the administration sends us a budget and capital and investment plan that cuts our knees out from under us, that cuts the Coast Guard's knees out from under it. If the administration is prepared to underfund and delay the recapitalization of the Coast Guard's assets by another decade, then it needs to tell us, Congress, and it needs to tell you, the Coast Guard, which missions you will no longer be asked to do. My question is, out of your 11 statutory missions, which ones will the service no longer be able to accomplish if funding remains the way it was this year, without Congress's help, where you lose half of your recapitalization budget, and if your funding stays at $900 million a year going forward, and we're unable to put that money back in there, which missions are you not going to do? I'm sure the Coast Guard has looked at this, because over the last few years, every report that I've read, the end of it says the Coast Guard needs to re-examine which missions it chooses to do based on the real life, and not the Coast Guard strategy, but the real life and the reality of the lack of funding, things like the OPC. Do we need to look at the OPC? What does it really need to do? Does it need to be in Sea State 5? Does it need to be a smaller NSC, or can we get by with having it be less capable, right? So things like that. What is the Coast Guard determined that its missions can be with the lack of funding that it's going to receive over the next decade, based on funding this year?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Chairman. I would say this. The Coast Guard is statutorily charged with 11 missions, 11 core missions. They aggregate into maritime safety, maritime security, protection of the environment. We cite our requirements to perform to a level of capacity across that 11 mission set. Depending on the resources that we receive, from an operational perspective in the near term, we can adjust capacity around the 11 mission capabilities that we have. But there are two issues here. One is what we do today, and the other one is what we do tomorrow, because there is a long-term investment requirement to maintain the capacity to do capabilities in those 11 missions. So the two issues are what are we doing today, and how are we going to invest to ensure that we can do it tomorrow? I acknowledge the fact that there have been numerous reports, many of which have been oriented toward validation of the program of record that exists. And universally, they have come out to date in support of the program of record as a reasonable approach. Given the economic times, the fiscal state of the economy, all the challenges that we're facing as a nation, of which we're fully recognized, we're not tone deaf to that, we think that the current budget demands of us tough choices on where we apply critical funds to the area we see as the highest level of risk. The highest level of risk has been identified in our portfolio as the offshore segment of our layered defense strategy. So we are required to make tough choices going into the future on what investments can we afford to, and what will we make to maintain a capacity across our 11 missions into the future. Quite frankly, were the recapitalization funding level to remain as it is into the future or be decremented, then that would require tough choices that put us in a situation where we will have to go back and say there are areas that we can't perform in, and over multiple years we will end up being a Coast Guard that looks different from today.
Where are those areas, the ones that you just mentioned, your last sentence?
The administration of the Department this year, and the Department and Secretary Napolitano has been particularly supportive of us through this, in our cutter recapitalization in particular. But what we've been asked to do is to accomplish a portfolio review. which basically is to take what you described as the GAO findings and reassess where we are with our acquisition portfolio, apply it to our missions, and find out what we can do and what we can't do. Because each one of those mission areas are statutorily mandated, I don't feel that it's incumbent on us to say what we cannot do, specifically capabilities-wise. Capacity-wise, we can say we can only do so much. But this portfolio review is going to be designed to look at what we do mission-wise and look at how we're postured to provide that capacity both today and into the future. And I think the results of the portfolio review will start to answer the questions that you're asking. So it won't be the Coast Guard saying, we won't do this or we can't do this. It will be a combination of the administration of the Department and the Coast Guard coming to a rigorous analysis of, given the realities of funding into the future, what can and what can't we do.
When is that portfolio review going to be completed?
It has started. We've had meetings with OMB and the Department, and so the effort started. We haven't totally agreed to when the product will come out. Part of it is dependent on the rigor that I described. We have models that we use that were the same models basically that set the force structure for Deepwater and our acquisition strategies to date. And we need to run the data through those models to come up with the effect on mission and the acquisition portfolio. So it's not just an arbitrary scan and cuts based on less than a rigorous analysis that's statistically based. It kind of goes back to what you were saying about what do we really need for Sea State 5? How many cutters do we need there? Show me the empirical case for that, and that's what we'll be generating.
Great. Would you come back after you complete that
Absolutely.
rigorous analysis? Great. Thank you, Admiral. Mr. Garamundi is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, following on your line of questions, if this budget scenario continues, this is, I think, the second year in which, or maybe even the third year in which we've seen these kinds of stresses placed on the budget, the acquisition budget, and now with sequestration on the operational budgets. This committee is going to have to seriously consider modifying the mission of the Coast Guard. And that's where this is headed. And you raised that question, Mr. Chairman, and we really need to get into this in detail. The last question that you raised, or the last request that you raised, is imperative. I hope it comes soon so that we can spend a good portion of our time in the remaining session this year to really get at that. And we need to understand the implications of it. Just this week, the Senate is dealing with border security in the immigration bill. And they have approved or about to approve an amendment. I think they did approve an amendment that would add $46.3 billion to border security on the Mexican border. We have a lot more border than Mexico. We have all of the maritime border, which is increasingly being used for immigrants. I think there's many cases that the Coast Guard can talk about. It seems to me that as we go through this immigration issue, and if in fact we're going to spend $46 billion on border security on the land, we need to think seriously about the rest of the border. And we also need to think seriously about threats to, let's just call it nuclear threats. We're spending projected to spend some $5 billion on an East Coast missile defense site, which assumes that Iran's going to send a missile our way, which would then assume that Iran disappears from the map. However, the more likely event is to use the ports. If we're going to have a missile, we're going to have a nuclear threat, it's not likely to come from a missile. It's likely to come from a container. So that brings us back to the role of the Coast Guard. Where I'm headed here, Mr. Chairman, is that we as members, as the deciders, to use a word from the previous administration, as the people that are going to make these decisions, we need to think about this in a holistic way. The National Defense Authorization Act that passed off the floor of the House added $2.6 billion for unknown airplanes, materials, and supplies for the Afghan National Army. We would never let the Coast Guard have $2.6 billion without explaining to us in detail how they're going to spend it down to the last pencil and bolt. But we've allocated $2.6 billion to the Afghan National Army in unspecified use. The problem's here. The problem's among the 535 of us that are making, frankly, some very irrational decisions. And we need to really think seriously about how we're going to deal with this. Admiral, I think to go back to you, beside my pontification here, you are going to have to, you and the Coast Guard are going to have to explain to us how you are going to carry out the missions, the statutory missions that you are faced with, given the fact that the Congress of the United States, together with the administration, is downsizing the Coast Guard. So what can be done? And we need to understand completely the implications of that. So when will we have that done?
Sir, I think as I said to the Chairman, the portfolio review is going to reveal those answers. It's going to establish a position from the administration, the Department, and the Coast Guard on, given levels of funding, what we'll be able to do and what we'll not be able to do. I think a basic, if you don't mind, just a very brief understanding of how we operate, especially in the context of the threat that you described, is probably important. We have developed post-9/11 a very sophisticated, layered strategy for the defense of our coastline and ports. It doesn't start 5 miles off the beach. It starts in foreign ports. It starts with IMO-type agreements on security regimes in foreign ports and our inspection of those ports. It depends on intelligence from all sources throughout the U.S. government and international partners on what are the anomalies on a container, what are the anomalies on a ship, and then it depends on a layered strategy for defense that starts offshore, because our goal would be to hold the threat away from our coast, to near shore, and to in the port. And I would tell you, in that layered strategy, which has proved to be quite effective, the weak link at this point is our offshore capability, and that translates into NSC and OPC. So what we're saying is we've laid out an acquisition strategy that has recapitalized successfully our in the port, to a large extent, our in the port capability, our near shore coastal, and our overseas capability in partnership with other government agencies and other nations is strong. It is the offshore capability that our ships present that are having the greatest decline in capacity and capability.
So bottom line of that is that the entire strategy has a serious flaw. That is, you're missing one of the key assets.
Well, what we'll show you, sir, is that as we are under fiscal duress like everyone else is in the Federal Government, we are going to make triage-like choices to go to that area of highest risk and spend the critical capital that we receive. And right now, that's why we're emphasizing the procurement of the NSCs and then the OPC follow-on. And we're fully aware that the OPC program needs to be affordable.
Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, for the national security cutters, the next one out is going to get delayed. Is that correct?
We have long lead funding for 7, and I have no information that there'll be delays in follow-on cutters.
So 7, how about 8?
8, we don't have long lead funding identified for 8, which would, if that were to be the case, result in about a year's delay and some cost increase.
Given the way in which the budget is going, and without a significant change on our part and the administration's, you're headed into a long-term budget that is headed down. Will you be able to, in that budget, provide for the 8th cutter?
Yes, sir, I believe we will, but it's going to be a great cost. And it is, as I said, it's a triage exercise.
Well, this goes back to what the Chairman was saying in his statement, is that we need to fully understand what the future is going to be here, and we need to have that in detail.
Yes,
we're
sir.
basically operating on yesterday's plan, which is not consistent with the current reality. And my point to us, 535 of us, is that we're making choices here about where to allocate the resources available for the United States government. And frankly, in my view, some of those choices are nonsense. And I made 2 points. $2.6 billion this coming year for the Afghan National Army to buy something. Mostly, I think it's probably to open another account in Qatar for the Karzai government. Let's move on. I yield back.
Thank the ranking member. I'd like to recognize the former chairman of this subcommittee, Mr. Lobiondo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple questions, Admiral, but before I do that, I wanted to just say, after having the opportunity to chair this subcommittee for 12 years, the budget that was sent to us is so separated from reality. I don't know, I'm a little bit concerned. I'm agreeing with Mr. Garamendi here. I don't know how much we agree on, but this is so short-sighted, and this is out of your lane. You've got to take what comes down from the top. But for the record, do we not remember what happened on September 11th? Do we not remember on September 10th, the Coast Guard had no Homeland Security really to deal with, and on September 11th, everything was ramped up, and we knew that we had to have the Coast Guard prepared? And yet we're spending money in areas, as Mr. Garamendi said, that nobody can keep track of. And the few dollars extra that we could use for the Coast Guard to be prepared, the most under-recognized and underappreciated service that there is, this is absurd. It is totally absurd. Almost a 50% cut in acquisitions takes us back to the 90s. What are we doing? When will we wake up? How to get that off. Admiral, in the last session, Mr. Larson and I teamed up together and saw reform of the Coast Guard acquisition, and we worked with the service to really get things back on track. I think we made a great deal of progress, but I remain concerned that a few of the assets delivered to date are still not performing anywhere close to expectations. For example, one of the reasons Deepwater proposed to replace 12 high-endurance cutters with the national security cutters was that the service would be able to get significantly more days away from the port with the NCS. Central to doing so was a crew rotation concept which the service has yet to formalize. The Coast Guard and Maritime Transportation Act of 2012, Mr. Garamendi, this may answer one of your questions, prevents the 6th National Security Cutter from becoming ready for operations until the service submits to Congress how the first 3 National Security Cutters will achieve the goal of 225 days away from home port. What is the plan for achieving 225 days away from home port, and when will you implement that plan?
Thank you, Mr. Lobiondo, for that question, and also thank you for your support over the years for our acquisition processes. You have been a great champion of our cause, and we truly appreciate that. To get to the crew rotation concept, which is what you're describing, the baseline of the legacy assets, the 378-foot cutter, was 185 days away from home port. The goal of the new program, the National Security Cutter, was 225, in some documents 230 in other documents, for the goal of days away from home port. We bring in new cutters on, new class of cutters. We've had a few growing pains, but not anything that is out of the norm for the Navy's experience or our previous experience. So where we are today is we will home port 3 cutters, or have home ported the first 3 cutters in Alameda, California. Those cutters are scheduled for dry dock availabilities over the next couple of years to do some configuration enhancements that were identified later in the class that need to be retrofitted, to do some maintenance, and basically will be in dry dock for a period of time. Those are the 3 cutters. Once those cutters are out of dry dock, we will have them in Alameda. We will marry up the extra crew. We will have the shore plant facility to run a full-scale evaluation on CRC. That will give us, the goal of CRC is 230 days away from home port. In the interim, until then, the cutters that exist, the national security cutters, will average across the fleet 210 days away from home port. So we are 20 days short of the eventual goal now. In the interim until 2017, late 2017, which is when we will be able to fully implement the evaluation of CRC, we will be 210 days until then, and then 230 days following. So the end of 2017 is when we will fully implement the 230-day crew or cutter requirement.
Well, 2017 is a long ways off. Mr. Chairman, I have another related question from the Inspector General, but recognizing my time, I'll wait for round 2.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Larson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Admiral, Section 220 of the Coast Guard Maritime Transportation Act of 2012 requires the Commandant to maintain the approved program of record for the acquisition of 180 RBMs, unless the Commandant transmits the committee documentation justifying a smaller acquisition. And as you know, the budget outlines a smaller acquisition, but we haven't received the justification for that smaller acquisition, the one that we specifically asked for. So have we missed that? Has the Coast Guard submitted the justification as it requires? And if we have not, when will we receive that written justification?
Thank you, Mr. Larson, for that question, and also your support over the years as well. As you know, the RBM program is fantastically successful for us. It had a long developmental...
I would argue right now it's only 17/18 successful.
Say again? I'm sorry.
It's only 17/18 successful. That is, you've stopped acquisition at 170 when we told you 180.
Yes, sir. Happy to answer that.
Yeah.
We've gone back and we've revalidated, because of the capabilities of this small boat, against our inshore threats and vulnerabilities, and we feel that due to the capabilities and capacities of this boat, which far exceed what we expected, that we feel, given the tough choices we're forced to make in this budget environment, that 170 is the proper number. That has been agreed to by our Assistant Commandant for Operations, who sets the requirements for the service. That will be coming forth an acquisition program baseline review for the RBM, which is in process now.
When do we expect to see that, though?
I'll have to get back to you for the record on that, sir.
Well, and I appreciate it. And we've been really, you and your team, it's been great working with the subcommittee here over the last several years to get things in order, and I do appreciate that. It just seems to me that if we don't get that justification report that we'd asked for in the 2012 Act until after you've fully completed the acquisition of 170 and terminated the program, that starting the program over again to get the additional 10 or more, if the committee so decides, then we'll have all the startup costs again, adding more to the program. So it can be seen, in my eyes, that you're terminating the program before we get the justification report, and then it's too late to go to 180. Do you see how I can see that?
Yes, sir. I see that, and I could do 2 things. First of all, I'll get back to the record, and you in particular, on the projected delivery of the acquisition program baseline change. And then I will get you preliminary documentation from our operations directorate that states the clear justification for 170, so you can review that in advance.
Sooner the better.
Yes, sir.
Great, thanks. On Arctic, with regards to Arctic policy, strategy that you released last month indicates a need for increasing maritime domain awareness in the Arctic. And what sort of resources does the Coast Guard plan on acquiring to improve that domain awareness in the Arctic?
Domain awareness in the Arctic is going to be a partnership effort. There's not going to be any unilateral organization, service, agency that's going to be able to come up with the resources to exert domain awareness or a real-time picture of what's going on in the Arctic. But in combination with the State of Alaska, with NOAA, with our partner component agencies, and the Department of Defense, I'm confident, and I can't discuss it higher than the unclass level, but I am confident that we can demonstrate today a high level of maritime domain awareness in the Arctic. So I think we're on a good track with that.
Well, now that you have the strategy, I know the DoD has its strategy. We're in my office. We're going to put more time into looking at what it takes to implement that strategy, and look forward to working with you on that. Can you give me then finally on offshore patrol cutter OPC? Can you give me and the committee an exact date when you'll down select from 8 to 3?
Yes, we will down select to 3 by the end of this fiscal year. The target is the end of this fiscal year. Mm-hmm. And then that will be for a preliminary and design contract.
Right.
And then there will be another year or so before we do the actual selection of the single cutter that will be the OPC.
Right.
So the end of the fiscal year will be the contract down select for 3 candidates that will produce preliminary contract design, and then a year later, and that's a softer date, will be the actual award of the contract for the offshore patrol cutter.
So if I may, Mr. Chairman, so the end of fiscal year is a hard date?
It is a target, sir.
Okay.
And it is in good faith. I can't tell you it is a hard and fast date, but indications are at this point that we will meet that target.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. I would like to welcome and also recognize the newest member of the subcommittee from South Carolina, Mr. Sanford. No questions? Ms. Hahn is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Garamendi, really appreciated the remarks that have been coming out of this committee this morning. I, of course, am one of those, since I represent the Port of Los Angeles, which is right next to the Port of Long Beach, largest port complex in this country. I have long said the Coast Guard is certainly the line of defense when it comes to our nation's coast and waters. But for me, particularly the port complex, I still am one, which I will always go on record saying, I believe our nation's ports are still one of our more vulnerable entryways into this country. I have never been happy with the fact that even though Congress passed a law after 9/11 to inspect our containers 100%, we're nowhere close to that. We've now all sort of just decided to accept the fact that we're inspecting 2 to 3% of our containers, and we're more of this at-risk, the layered strategy of defense, which makes me uncomfortable. We have 5,000 men and women that work on our docks on a daily basis. There's about close to 1 million people probably just close to the proximity of Long Beach and LA ports. If there was something to happen at that port, loss of lives, but certainly would absolutely disrupt this nation's economy and potentially the global economy if something happened. So I am all about really completely, I hope we can increase the funding for our Coast Guard, the men and women who we really do depend on to protect us. Last time we had a committee hearing with my friend Peter Neffinger, Vice Admiral, who used to be the captain of the port at Los Angeles. He testified that the Coast Guard's cutter fleet was approaching between 40 and 50 years, and because of its age, it was becoming less reliable and suffering more casualties, forcing the Coast Guard to cut down on its patrol hours over the last 5 years. In fact, according to a report by the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security, patrol and flight hours have decreased somewhere between 8 and 12%. So can you talk to this committee a little bit about your aging fleet and how that has reduced the Coast Guard's operational capacity, and how sequestration might, on top of that, added to that problem, and how does that impact you? And I'll throw in my other question. I'm very concerned about the panga boats that are a huge threat, certainly out on the West Coast. Fortunately, we lost great Coast Guard member when the Halibut was rammed by a panga boat, Chief Petty Officer Terrell Horn. I'm really worried about that. I'm worried about that from a security standpoint. Kinds of, it's human trafficking potentials, drug potential, and let me know if you can tell this committee what our strategy is in light of everything to address that issue. So both those, that your aging fleet, sequestration, and can you give us some comfort on your strategy for the very dangerous panga boat epidemic that's rising?
Thank you for those questions, ma'am. I'll start with the aging fleet. We have 3 classes of cutter, basically. We have a patrol boat, which is being replaced by the FRC, the OPC medium endurance cutter class, and then the larger class of cutter, the offshore, the national security cutter. Where our gaps are, as I've explained, really are tiered. We're in good shape inshore with the patrol boats, and you see that every day in Los Angeles, LA, Long Beach. We're in okay shape for now for our medium class of cutter, which the OPC is designed to replace. Where our gap is in our larger ships, the ones that patrol the Bering Sea, offshore CONUS, the Eastern Pacific, the Western Caribbean, drug engagement, migrant engagement, this is where our most serious gap is at this point. Our aviation fleet is in reasonable shape, and I'll hopefully talk later a little bit about the C-27 and what that might mean to us. As we move into the budget environment that we're in, we continue to focus on our greatest area of risk from a capabilities perspective, and that is the national security cutter. Funding that ship, which is a fundamental enhancement to, it is 8 ships for 12 ships, the older ones that we're laying up, but it is a huge enhancement in capability. As I explained before, the Berthoff's case with the UAV and the helicopter and the fast interdiction boat, the over-the-horizon RIB, and the C4 capability is just something we've never had before and enhances our effectiveness. But that's where the gap is. The gap is in offshore, and the national security cutter is the key to that. The offshore patrol cutter will be the next critical acquisition, and we've talked a little bit about that. Sequestration effect on mission. I would never tell you that sequestration would have an effect of being a drop in missions, like we're going along fine and then all of a sudden we're not doing a mission. It is an erosive effect, all right? I'll give you an example. While we will never compromise our ability to do search and rescue and the most critical law enforcement missions, there is a reduction in our ability to put steel on target for certain areas like counter-narcotics in the Eastern Pacific. We have less ship days, less aircraft days, fewer days down there, and they are part of a system. They're intertwined because you have to have a surface asset to do the interdiction. My concern over the long term in sequestration is that erosive effect will start to get to some of those missions that we've been doing, and we will see a reduction in our ability to interdict drugs and criminal activity and even migrants to a certain extent. To get to Southern California, our #1 operational priority now is an operation called Baja Tempestad, which is run between L.A. to San Diego, okay, because that's where we see the panga threat. That panga threat actually, you've seen landings as far north as Monterey, which is amazing considering it's an open boat. So what we've done is we've put a block down there with our assets in leadership of component agencies like Border Patrol, Customs, Border Protection, the local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies down there. And I think that focus is showing great yield. We're interdicting. We're stopping. Some are getting through. But I think Baja Tempestad is a real success story, and it shows not only our agility, but the agility of the Department of Homeland Security to put a block in place where there's an emergent crisis. As they become more effective in shutting down the land border, you are going to see the end run in the maritime because there's little resistance to that. And it's incumbent on us to make sure that we allocate resources accordingly to do the block there. And it also is a case on the Texas side, to be perfectly honest, off Brownsville. So I don't think sequestration to this point has affected Baja Tempestat, but it is affecting our overarching ability to put steel on target for some of these mission areas. I hope that answers your question.
The gentlelady's time has expired. I'd like to recognize Mr. Young for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will make this short, and I do apologize for being late. Admiral, I see in your budget you get $8 million acquisition funding to initiate a survey and design activities for a new polar icebreaker. But that was in 2013. Now, 2014, I see there's only $2 million. It's my understanding the Coast Guard's 5-year capital investment plan included an additional $852 million for FY14 for acquiring the ship. I was told that the Coast Guard anticipated awarding a construction contract for that ship within the next 5 years and taking delivery of the ship within a decade. Are we still on the track for the 5-year program?
Yes, sir, we are. And I say that the acquisition construction of an icebreaker, first of class, only of class likely, is a very complex undertaking.
I want to, again, don't take too long to answer these questions. I want to ask you a question. If you're still, Admiral Papp and I have discussed this for years.
Yeah, we're on track.
In 1980, we had the last study about leasing a vessel. Because I still don't think Congress is going to appropriate $1 billion, approximately $1 billion to build an icebreaker. I mean, that's something I would like to have a request, that, maybe I will request to the Coast Guard to look into the possibility of getting a leasing on a vessel that's American-built. Because we need those icebreakers in the Arctic. We had the Operation Arctic Shield. Really, you did what you had, less iron on the ground, but the Arctic is the future. And we're way behind, because I can't get people to understand it, but I can't see this Congress at this time and the later time appropriating $1 billion to build an icebreaker. We did this once 38 years ago with the Polar Star and I think the Polaris and the Healy, which reminds me, Admiral, where's the status of the Polaris and the Polar Star now? Are they totally scrapped, or are they going to be fixed, or are they going to be operational?
Polar Star is underway as we speak. Just finished refit, is fit for sea, and is actually going to the ice to get some experience for the crew in the northern tier before they deploy to McMurdo next year. The Polar Sea is in caretaker status. It is cold iron, we would call it, tied to a pier in Seattle, and we're trying to determine what the future is for that ship. The Healy is a full-up midlife ship. It's a science ship, as you know, and is executing its scheduled missions.
Well, again, if you looked, as a Coast Guard look at the refitting cost of the I believe it's the Polaris, versus waiting now, according to this, 15 years before we have an icebreaker at sea.
Well, we have the Healy's midlife. We've got a long-term availability for her. The Polar Sea, or the Polar Star, is got 7 to 10 years of life left in her. And the Sea, to refit the Sea, I think that was one of your questions.
Yes.
Would be about 3 years and about $100 million to bring that from cold iron back to a 7 to 10 year life left.
What I'm trying to get across, according to the schedule, the 5-year schedule and the decade, that's 15 years at least, and that's probably optimistic, if you build a new ship. And I would like to have the Coast Guard look at the possibility of getting all 3 of the older icebreakers operational so they can be dispersed in the Arctic. And secondly, look at the cost-benefit ratio of a icebreaker that could be leased at a cheaper rate, I believe, than you can get one built and get it in the field sooner. Because I really think China's all up there, as you know, and Russia's up there. Everybody's fooling around the Arctic but the United States. And I just think it's time it's our responsibility to fund you, but I think it's time at the Coast Guard maybe think out of the box a little bit, take those 3 ships, get them operational, and make sure they can do the job until, if you're going to build one, and we appropriate the money for it, or you lease it or whatever it is, so we can have a full force of the Arctic activity up there, because, like I say, China's up there. I don't know whether you've done this or not, I'm about out of time. Have you looked at the type of vessels now are trespassing across that Arctic area in the Northwest Passage, and what they're carrying?
Yes, sir. We have pretty good awareness of what's going on up there. On the Russian side, the North Sea route they call it, there's all kinds of activity over there. On our side, it's been generally to mineral exploitation in Alaska or the offshore drilling. But there's also cruise ships and some other things that are going on up there, ecotourism, and we have full visibility of that.
All right, Admiral, my time's up, but just, I would really appreciate it if we maybe think out of the box. And I know I've had this argument with every Admiral for the last 40 years. I know you like to own steel, but sometimes it's not very efficient. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman from Alaska. Mr. Garamendi is recognized for 5 minutes.
I have great confidence in the gentleman from Alaska taking care of the the icebreakers. If only we could give you an opportunity for a maybe, yes, we'd have to change the rules, wouldn't we, so that you could have your own little program up there.
I'm willing to secede from the Union right now. For an earmark.
And then you could be Emperor of the North. I'd like to move to the aircraft issue, and specifically most of us on this committee also serving on the Armed Services Committee, so the issue of the C-27 comes up. And we could have a discussion about the C-27. The acquisition for the Maritime Patrol Aircraft Program seems to be moving from acquiring a new plane to acquiring the C-27s. Where are you with the C-27s? What's the negotiations with the Air Force? We can probably have something to do with that if you're basing this whole program on the C-27s. Let's talk about it.
Okay, sir, at the risk of giving too long an answer, I apologize in advance, but
take your time.
Our program of record was for the HC-144, which is a CASA is the name of the aircraft. We have 18 of them funded. We have 15 delivered, and we have funding for 18 aircraft, 17 mission pallets. So you've got basically a cargo aircraft that in it has a very sophisticated sensor package. We would be forced to take a strategic pause in that acquisition. In fiscal year 14 and subsequent, we'd have to re-examine the affordability of the aircraft vis-a-vis the whole acquisition portfolio. What became available, or likely will become available, is the C-27J, which is a cargo aircraft that the Air Force operates. There are 14 in existence and 7 being delivered. The NDAA last year carved out 7 for the Forest Service for firefighting activity, and we feel that leaves 14 of these aircraft potentially available for the Coast Guard. And it would be a mill-to-mill transfer. In other words, it's not like transferring to a civilian agency. It's much easier. You sign basically a form, and it transfers to our service. It comes, they're very low-time airframes, actually was a finalist candidate for the MPA originally, okay? It comes with SATCOM radar, some of the things that we need to do our jobs. There are a couple of some sensors that would have to be added to the aircraft, but we would be able to use it right away. So this is 14 aircraft that, depending on how many we get, could be up to 750 to 800 million cost avoidance if we're able to execute this deal. Where it is now is it's in the Air Force's court. We're on record. Secretary Napolitano's talked to Secretary Hagel. We're on record for 14 to 21. If we took all of those aircraft on, we would probably stop our acquisition of the MPA, focus on operationalizing these aircraft, and have that class of aircraft bought out. So,
the current acquisition program is for what kind of plane?
The current acquisition,
and who makes it?
It's called a CASA, is a generic term for it. It's HC-144, twin-engine transport-type aircraft with an embedded sensor package. The original program of record was 36.
Right.
We're funded for 18.
Basically halfway there.
So we would stop at halfway. We would take on the C-27 to complete that capabilities requirement. What it would give us is 2 classes of aircraft in the medium range.
Where I'm going, I understand. You'd have 2 different airplanes you'd have to maintain, so you got some issues having to do with maintenance and so forth. There's going to be a kickback from whoever's manufacturing that plane, the CASA. Who manufactures the CASA?
It's made by a company called Alania, and they are an overseas company. But
it's a foreign company that's manufacturing the CASA.
Oh, no, CASA, the original aircraft, is made by a European company. I thought you were asking about the C-27J. They're also made.
They're on the ground or flying, one or the other. Just wondering where the kickback comes from. Somebody loses 18 aircraft, we hear about it, but it's a foreign company that does that. Thank you. So you're going to save some $700 to $800 million if we carry this out?
Could be 500 to 750 or so.
Okay. And what I need to know, and perhaps the committee also, is that moving slowly? Are there speed bumps? Are there other problems that might cause that to go off track?
I don't foresee it at this point. The decision has to be made by the Secretary of the Air Force, basically, and with a concurrence of Secretary of Defense. We've signaled strongly that we're ready to accept them at any time.
My personal opinion, it's a really good idea to acquire those, and whatever modifications are necessary, put those into the budget so that gets done. Potential savings of, $750 million is significant. And I know there's going to be some kickback coming from whoever doesn't have that contract to manufacture the remaining 18. I think we can handle that. So if you'll let us know, I know that, I don't know, 4 of us that were up here on the Armed Services Committee, and I think we're aware of the potential problems there. I have no further questions.
Mr. Lobiondo is recognized.
Thanks again, Mr. Chairman. I have a follow-up question, Admiral, tagging on to the first one. But before I do, I'm sorry, I got to continue my rant a little bit about this budget. What I don't think most people understand is, in addition to the acquisition problem that we have, that we are decimating the Coast Guard's leadership for the future. I have the honor of representing the only Coast Guard recruit training center in the nation. For years and years and years, the throughput was about 5,000 recruits. If I'm not mistaken, I think this year it's going to be about 2,000. I think it's damaging morale, and I think the officer corps that we rely on for the experience and the expertise and the motivation for the younger ones is just going to be gutted here. So from every aspect we look at this, these are intangibles that you can't measure. These are intangibles that you can't read on a spreadsheet somewhere about what it's going to mean. So I don't know what we can do about this, but I'm pretty cranked up over it, and this won't be the last I have to say. Admiral, the second part of the question, the first part was about the days at sea. Both the DHS Inspector General and the GAO have raised concerns that the national security cutters delivered to date do not meet planned capability. Now, when we talked about how these would be laid out, we focused a lot on capability because we knew we'd have one shot at doing this right. They have noted that without unmanned aircraft systems on the national security cutters, the national security cutters are no more capable than the 40-year-old high-endurance cutters that they're replacing. So as we are squeezed down with acquisitions, it's important that what we do have out there in acquisitions have the maximum capability. What is the status of the service's plans to acquire UAS or other capability for the national security cutter and fill the current capability gap? And when will the national security cutter be outfitted with UAS?
Thank you, sir, for that question. Specifically to the national security cutter, we have a UAS on board the Berthoff now. We're running a test that is the Scan Eagle. It's a small, lightweight, but very capable UAS that's being tested today as we speak. Earlier I described a case where they had great success. The second UAS that might conceivably be used with a national security cutter is the Navy Fire Scout program, which we're very close to. As you know, sir, originally we had our own program for a UAS for the national security cutter, but about 6 years ago we decided to go with the Navy to let them do the science on this thing. They have proved the concept of this thing in Afghanistan and in theater in the Persian Gulf. And I hold great promise that as it's developed, we'll be able to adapt it to the national security cutter. I don't have a time for you because we don't control the program. In the interim, we will use that small, lightweight, highly capable UAS package on the National Security Cutter, and it will fill probably 70% of the mission that we would have, we will eventually use Fire Scout for. The third thing we're doing UAS-wise is the Guardian Predator project we have going with CBP. We're supporting them. General Atomics makes that aircraft. I met with them, their chief engineer, to talk about what marinization means and what tailoring that aircraft would require for Coast Guard use. It was a very productive meeting, and I think that we're eventually going to have that class of UAS supporting the cutter offshore as well. So there's progress being made, sir.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, I think that the capability component of these national security cutters is key, and I just hope that the Coast Guard isn't using the Navy sort of to slow walk what we're able to do here. There ought to be some way we can try to have some inquiries or get this jacked up, because if you have no idea, then that means we're years away, and I just don't think that's acceptable. But I thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. I have a question for the record, Admiral. Just if you could update us on the response boat smalls, that program. You talked about having you talked about an 11-foot rib and a smaller rib. Is that right?
Well, sir, we're talking about a little bit of two different things, okay? The 7 and 11-meter ribs are the cutter boats. They go on the ships. And we're going to go to 2 classes of them for all kinds of reasons: economy, effectiveness of maintenance, and all that. The RBS is actually the import boat, and we're evaluating the fleet size on them, and we're recapitalizing them as is required. 25 feet long, very successful. You see them everywhere in the United States. So there are 2 distinct classes of boats.
Is that program being cut significantly? The response boat small program?
The Response Boat Small program is not being cut as a result of budgetary pressure. We're reevaluating our need for the number of those boats based on our experience post 9/11 and what we really need to do the port security job. So adjustments to that fleet size will be based on operational requirements, not budgetary pressure.
Okay. Admiral, thank you. Thank you for your service, and thank you for your time. There are no further. Oh, Ms. Hahn, do you have more questions? I'd like to recognize Ms. Hahn. We do have a second panel we need to get through as well.
Okay, thank you. I'll be brief. Just a quick change of subject, because you did touch on it in your statement. And as you know, the ineffective handling of sexual assault cases has plagued the military recently, and there's been a huge push to make some major reforms in this area. So obviously, sitting here looking at all the men showing up for this hearing, has the Coast Guard made any changes to how it deals with sexual assault cases? And could you tell us what specific policies has the Coast Guard implemented?
Yes, ma'am. We recognized this problem about a year ago, and it became the object of focus for the service. Subsequent to that, there's a film called The Invisible War, which I'm sure you're familiar with. It's become a banner headline. But I'll tell you that we have a service-level strategy, a senior executive working group that tiers down into working groups. We have overhauled our training. We have overhauled our messaging. We have overhauled our system of accountability for not only perpetrators, but for commanders that have environments that are perhaps permissive. They are held accountable as well. We are in lockstep with the Department of Defense and the other military services, and we are cooperating with Congress and the Department and the administration. Universally, this is held as a problem. This behavior is a crime. It's a breach of trust, and we are committed to eradicating this behavior from the service because it is a matter of trust. And as I said in my opening statement, that is a priceless attribute that we have in the military.
Gentlelady, yield back. Okay. Admiral, thank you for your time and your testimony and your service. So, I'd like the second panel to come forward, please. Our second panel of witnesses include Mr. Ronald O'Rourke of the Congressional Research Service, Dr. Stephen Bucci, did I say that right? Bucci, Director of the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation, and Dr. Lawrence Korb, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress. Mr. O'Rourke, you are now recognized.
Chairman Hunter, Ranking Member Garamendi, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on Coast Guard acquisition. Chairman Hunter, with your permission, I'd like to submit my statement for the record and summarize it here in a few brief remarks. The Coast Guard's FY14 5-year acquisition plan has about a third less funding than last year's plan. That's the largest reduction in a 5-year plan that I've seen in many years, and it has occurred in the absence of any change in the Coast Guard's strategic environment that might substantially reduce Coast Guard mission demands. The plan's average funding level of $1 billion a year would likely require the Coast Guard to reduce procurement rates, which would increase unit costs, lengthen replacement times, and possibly compel the Coast Guard to further extend the lives of aging platforms. The likely eventual result would be a smaller and/or older Coast Guard with less mission capacity than called for in the program of record. In this sense, the plan raises a fundamental question for Congress about the Coast Guard's ability to recapitalize its assets in a timely manner and adequately perform its statutory missions in coming years. It also raises a potential oversight question for Congress concerning year-to-year stability in DHS budget planning and the reliability of DHS budget projections. In assessing the Coast Guard's future needs, it can be noted as a starting point that although the program of record force would have considerably more capacity than the legacy force, the Coast Guard has estimated that the program of record force would nevertheless have substantial capacity gaps for performing 6 of the Coast Guard's 11 statutory missions in coming years. If funding limits lead to a Coast Guard that is smaller and/or older than the program of record force, these mission gaps would be greater still. It's not clear that past annual amounts of Coast Guard acquisition funding are necessarily the most appropriate guide to what the funding level should be in coming years, since the Coast Guard has entered a period during which it's seeking to replace multiple classes of assets that in past budget years were not yet in need of replacement. A reliance on past funding levels as the sole guide to future funding levels could short-circuit the policymaking process, limit options available to policymakers, and hamper their ability to alter the composition of federal spending over time to meet changing federal needs. In seeking potential alternative guides to future Coast Guard acquisition funding, comparisons with the Navy are potentially illuminating. These comparisons suggest that if the Coast Guard's acquisition account were made proportionate to Navy procurement funding, the account might total about $3.5 billion a year. That figure might be discounted to account for the expensive platforms procured by the Navy. Discounting it by a third or a half, for example, would produce a figure of $1.7 to $2.3 billion a year for the AC&I account. The Coast Guard, for its own part, has testified that recapitalizing the service's assets on a timely basis would require up to $2.5 billion a year. A level of $1 billion a year, the Coast Guard has testified, would almost create a death spiral. The Navy makes substantial use of multi-year procurement and block buy contracting to reduce ship and aircraft procurement costs. The Coast Guard, in contrast, is not using these contracting mechanisms. The difference between the Navy's substantial use of multi-year procurement and block buy contracting and the Coast Guard's non-use of these mechanisms is striking. The non-use of these mechanisms by the Coast Guard in past years may in some cases represent lost opportunities for reducing Coast Guard acquisition costs. Moving forward, current Coast Guard programs that might be considered candidates for multi-year procurement or block buy contracting include the NSC program, the OPC program, and the FRC program. These points lead to a number of potential options for Congress. I'll just mention 4. One would be to encourage or direct DHS to program a certain minimum amount of funding each year into the AC&I account. Another would be to provide the Coast Guard with greater autonomy from DHS in determining the funding level for the AC&I account. A third would be to encourage or direct DHS and the Coast Guard to use multi-year procurement and block buy contracting where appropriate. And a fourth would be to reduce the Coast Guard's statutory missions to narrow the future potential gap between Coast Guard mission requirements and projected Coast Guard capacity for performing them. These options underscore the point made earlier, that the FY14 plan raises a fundamental question for Congress about the Coast Guard's ability to recapitalize its assets in a timely manner and adequately perform its statutory missions in coming years. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my statement. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to the subcommittee's questions.
Thank the gentleman. Dr. Bucci is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, members, I thank you for having me here. I'll let you know that the comments I make are my own and not to be construed as official positions of the Heritage Foundation. Prior to joining the Heritage Foundation, I did spend 30 years as a military officer in the Army Special Forces, and then was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense, where I was DOD's plug into the Department of Homeland Security and worked extensively with the Coast Guard. I really want to thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I'm not going to be redundant with my colleagues on some of the specifics, and I believe the committee is probably just as expert as I am on many of these details. But I have to tell you, the Coast Guard is a key national security asset. It is not a secondary force. It is one of the key players in defending our country. And right now, regardless of what we say or do here, they are being given an expanding mission set in the midst of contracting assets and resources. The Coast Guard, to their credit, uses imagination and innovation to accomplish the mission on a pretty regular basis. They also have not yet learned how to work the Washington system, asking for twice as much as you think you need because you know you're only going to get half of that. They actually ask for what they think they might be able to get by with, and then it still gets cut in half. The Coast Guard is never more in character as a military organization than at budget time. They get their orders, they are given their assets, they salute, and then they go out and try and do their mission or die trying. And I think it's incumbent on the Congress particularly, because unfortunately I think the administration doesn't seem to get this, that there's a lot of precious young men and women out there who are putting their lives on the line in vessels and aircraft that are in many cases older than they are. And while that may be okay in some situations, the ones the Coast Guard goes into, that is not an acceptable situation. I will touch on one specific thing, not to pile on with Mr. Young too much, but with the Icebreaker Fleet, the Coast Guard study says for them to operate in the Arctic and in Antarctica, they need 3 medium and 3 heavy icebreakers. Right now, they've got the 1 medium and the 2 heavies, which frankly don't work. I think we should go beyond his idea of leasing icebreakers and give them an exemption to the Jones Act and let them lease some standing icebreakers that are not U.S. made, because we really need to have this capability. It's embarrassing, not too different than riding on the Russians' rocket ships to get up into space now, that we have to ride behind Russian icebreakers to resupply the McMurdo Research Station in Antarctica. I just find that somewhat ironic. Right now, Congress, if it does not act to correct the chronic underfunding of the Coast Guard's fleet revitalization plan, we are going to continue to ask those young men and women to put their lives at risk while they protect our country. The maintenance costs of this aging fleet are getting way out of hand and are going to suck the air out of the very small revitalization funding we already have, and that has to be turned around. The Coast Guard continues to perform its missions admirably, and they will find it increasingly difficult to keep up that pace as their assets begin to deteriorate further. So I would ask the Congress to fulfill its constitutional responsibility to provide for the common defense by making a commitment, and I think this committee is making that commitment, to fund them at a level that meets the needs of the service, in some cases in excess of what the service itself is asking for. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Dr. Korb is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Garamendi. Appreciate the opportunity to come. It's also appreciate the opportunity to be on a panel with such other distinguished people. My association with the Coast Guard goes back to the 1960s when I worked with them as a naval officer off the coast of Vietnam. The interesting thing, they still have a lot of the same ships that they had back then. I spent 4 years teaching at the Coast Guard Academy. Admiral Papp was there, but he didn't take a course from me, so I guess that's probably one reason why he got ahead. And I worked with them when I was in the Reagan administration on the war on drugs, and a couple of times when I went to Iraq, and I saw them working there. And I think that's a key thing. People forget just what they do. They don't realize that they have all of these missions. Now, and it's become clear to me that over the years, one of their problems is their motto, theoretically, is always prepared, but their unofficial motto seems to be, we can do more with less. And if you go back and you take a look at, for example, when sequestration came up, Secretary Panetta talked about, well, if we have sequestration, the Navy will be back where it was before World War I. If you ask the Coast Guard, they'll say, well, give us less money, we'll just do the best we can. They don't really, I think, make it clear as to the jeopardy they're in. Now, it's become clear in the testimony today that the Coast Guard has some management problems, but they pale in comparison to the Department of Defense. I have in my written testimony, which I'd like to put into the record, an article by Senator McCain on April 26th of this year. And he talked, and he said, the Pentagon turns billions of taxpayer dollars into weapon systems that are consistently delivered late, flawed, and vastly over budget if these weapon systems are delivered at all. He mentions the fact that the Air Force canceled a weapon system for $1 billion that, in fact, is larger than the Coast Guard acquisition budget, the Expeditionary Combat Support System. So what are we going to do? We all agree that they need more money. What we need is a unified national security budget. The Coast Guard has to be taken into account when the executive and legislative branches decide where to allocate scarce resources. For example, it's been mentioned by Congresswoman Hahn and Mr. Garamendi, the whole question about port security versus missile defense, okay? If you take a look, what we spent on missile defense since I was in government, okay, it's over $200 billion. And a lot of scientists tell us it might not even work so well. What are we spending on port security? And as Congressman Garamendi mentioned, if I am going to send a nuclear weapon to the United States, it's much less likely that I am going to launch a missile with a return address. It's much more likely that I'm going to bring it in through the port. But yet, we take a look at what the Coast Guard budget is compared to the Department of Defense. You take a look and you compare the Coast Guard budget to that of the Navy in terms of the number of people plus what we spent on procurement. The littoral combat ship, which Senator McCain criticizes in this article, it costs more than your national security cutters and has 1/3 the range. Okay, and yet we don't get an opportunity to make those trade-offs. I would like to, with the committee's consent, to put our unified national security budget into the record, because we go over that every year to show how you can do those things. Now, let me conclude with two other things that the Coast Guard needs to do in addition to making these trade-offs. Number one, the Commandant needs to be a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. When you had the hearing on sexual assault, I noticed he was at the table. Get him at the table all the time. They have all of these missions. You've just added the director of the National, the head of the National Guard to the chiefs. Put the Commandant there. The other thing is they're going to need the equivalent of a service secretary in the Department of Homeland Security, someone like the Secretary of the Army, Navy, or Air Force who could come here and speak up for them. And then the final thing I would say is Secretary Panetta, Secretary Hagel asked Armed Services committees to do something about the escalating cost of personnel benefits. Well, the committee has not yet this year, but they also impact the Coast Guard because they have to go along with whatever the Department of Defense does. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, all of you, for being here today. Let me ask you, Mr. O'Rourke, why do you think they haven't done multi-year procurements if they're authorized to do so?
It's a good question, Mr. Chairman. I've asked that myself. It's not clear to me why it's not happening. One possible contributor might simply be a lack of awareness of the mechanism. The use of multi-year procurement and block buy contracting has grown in DOD in recent years, and it could simply be that the Coast Guard has not caught up with that.
Most shipbuilders do multi-year procurement.
That's right. In fact, all three of the Navy's year-to-year shipbuilding procurement programs are now under either multi-year procurement contracting or block-buy contracting, all three of them. And so, as I said in my testimony, the difference between the Navy's substantial use of these mechanisms and the Coast Guard's non-use of them is striking. Multi-year procurement can save upwards of 10% on the cost of what you're buying, and especially if we're going into a tighter budget environment, there's more reason than ever to perhaps consider using them. Now, there's reasons why you might not want to use multi-year procurement or block-buy contracting, and you have to consider carefully whether you want to do it or not. But if you decide that it is appropriate, it can offer savings at a time when apparently the Coast Guard needs those savings more than ever.
You also noted that the Coast Guard can successfully, or if it wants to successfully conduct all of its missions, then it needs to acquire more boats, more assets. So the question then is, if they don't get the money to acquire more assets, what does that mean for its ability to conduct its mission, and in what way do you think the Coast Guard should change its mission set?
That's right. In fact, I think it's worth remembering, as I mentioned in my opening statement, that the program of record of force itself is not capable of fully performing all the Coast Guard statutory missions as the Coast Guard has estimated. The force that would be needed to do that could require up to 60% more cutters and up to 90% more aircraft than what's included in the program of record of force. So the POR force is already somewhere short of what the Coast Guard has calculated would be needed to perform the service's statutory missions in coming years. If you fall short of the POR force, you're only making those mission shortfalls even greater. Multi-year procurement and block-buy contracting can, at the margin at least, help the Coast Guard afford a larger force for a given amount of money. For example, the OPC program is currently estimated at $12.1 billion. If you are able to save somewhere between 5 and 10% of the procurement cost on that program, then you're looking at saving somewhere between $600 million and $1.2 billion, which can go some way toward buying OPCs or other platforms that the Coast Guard is interested in getting.
Thank you, Mr. O'Rourke. Recognized.
Mr. O'Rourke, in your written testimony, you spent some time on the C-27. The thing that I'm curious about is that there's a potential savings here of some $750 million. Is that savings, and this is a question I think more for us on our side, but it seems to me that savings is not going to be plowed back into the other acquisition programs for the Coast Guard, but rather disappears into the black hole of the larger budget for the U.S. government.
As I look at the Coast Guard's 5-year acquisition plan, it appears to me that the Coast Guard's budget already banks on receiving those C-27s. They've already taken the credit for it. You will have an avoided cost if you don't buy the remaining 18 HC-144s. That's like a $40 or $50 million airplane. So that's several $100 million in avoided procurement costs. But the Coast Guard's 5-year acquisition plan already appears to take credit for that by zeroing out the HC-144 line for the remainder of the program. The Coast Guard's referring to it as a pause, and it is a pause in the sense that they're waiting to see whether they get the 14 to 21 C-27s. If they don't, that requirement rolls back into the Coast Guard's 5-year plan, and you're looking at another bill for several $100 million that currently is not reflected in the 5-year plan.
Thank you. I understand that, and even more completely because of your answer. But where I wanted to go is that it appears to me that the Coast Guard is getting no credit, that is, does not have the ability to repurpose, reuse that $700+ million to fund its other programs. It looks to me like they're simply taking the budget's coming up short, even though they're saving $700 million, potentially saving $700 million.
The removal of the money for the HC-144s represents about 1/3 of the total reduction in funding that we see in this plan versus the 5-year plan from last year.
Here's,
It's
I think, the
about
question.
$900 million that they've taken away.
For those of us on the policy side of this, it seems to me that we need to provide a significant incentive, in this case for the Coast Guard and perhaps for also for other services, that if they're able to, in this, as we see here, find a way to save $750 million, then they ought to be able to take that $750 million and apply it to other acquisition programs that are short of money. It appears to me that's not the case here, and therefore there's little incentive, even though the Coast Guard seems to be doing it, to find those kinds of savings. Just something for us to consider and for you to ponder, given your role, so that there's this incentive built into the system that save money and then you can use it elsewhere. I'll let that go at that. And I think this is, again, for the members of this committee that serve on the Armed Services Committee, is to make sure that those planes are transferred. I mean, we can do that. We have that power. Transfer the planes, shut up, get on with it. And I'd recommend that we do that. I want to go to Mr. Korb and your question about a unified budget, which has been the subject of much of what I've talked about here, is that we're not considering the overall defense or national security. We're looking at it in a segmented and disjointed way. There seems to me to be two ways to get at that. You're suggesting one of them, which is the placement of a member of the Coast Guard in the Department of Defense's program that is sitting there with the other generals and admirals. Good idea. There's also another problem, and that is the organization of the House of Representatives and perhaps the Senate, which you didn't talk to. This committee, the Coast Guard, is specifically in the T&I Committee, Transportation Infrastructure, and therefore disconnected in policy and similarly disconnected in the appropriation process. Now, we can send a Coast Guard Admiral to sit over at the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but unless you take the next step, which is the organization of the House of Representatives, it ain't going to count much. So, I guess more than anything else, I'm really talking about us in almost everything I've said today. It's how we view the world. Mr. Korb, would you care to comment? You chose not to do that, and I appreciate your deference to us. But
no, I think both the administration and the Congress need to do it. You know, when we unified the Department of Defense, you used to have a committee that dealt with the Navy and the War Department, and then you created Armed Services. I think the administration needs to take the lead in this through OMB by having a unified national security budget that looks at, if you will, offense, which is the Department of Defense, defense, which is Homeland Security, and development, which is State Department, looks at them all. And we have done it for the last 8 years. We've taken the amount that the Bush administration and now Obama, we take whatever amount you say you want for all three, and we show how you can get more bang for the buck, if you will, by doing these things. And I would suggest that if they take the lead, then the Congress, like you have a budget committee, has a national security committee that looks at all of those things together and suggests some of the trade-offs, some of which we've discussed today. And you're not going to overcome your budgets. In other words, we take whatever amount that you put in your budget and we say this is a way you can get. I mean, the average age of the Navy ships is like 1/3 of that of the Coast Guard. So at some point you might sit down and say, well, maybe we ought to give the Coast Guard a newer ship and the Navy one less ship, or you take an aircraft out, or whatever it might be. And I think that would help. We would get more security for whatever amount of money that you're willing to spend.
I thank you for Mr. Bucci, you are from an organization known to be fiscally conservative. Could you comment on this issue?
Well,
recognizing that you're not speaking for the organization.
I do. While I agree in the general principle, I think probably a good interim step might be to look at the Department of Homeland Security's budget, which has gone up recently, while the Coast Guard, which frankly, no offense to any of the other wonderful organizations within DHS, the Coast Guard is by far the most efficient and useful and necessary for national defense of any of the constituent parts of DHS, their budget has consistently gone down. So perhaps before we try and merge the budgets of the Department of Defense with chunks of DHS, we get DHS to sort of synchronize their own budget internally and give a little bit more of the assets to one of their parts that's really pulling a lot more weight than they might otherwise do.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, you've been very generous with my time, but just one final comment. If we would look at the Department of Homeland Defense budget, it's boots on the ground that seem to be far more important than ships on the sea. Am I correct?
Right now, given the debate we've been having for the last couple of weeks, Congressman, I would say you're absolutely right.
I yield back the 3 minutes and 6 seconds beyond the 5 minutes, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Hahn is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Korb, you are speaking, obviously, a theme that I have been talking about since 9/11, which I think our ports are very underfunded when it comes to our homeland security. And you mentioned in your testimony that the likelihood of a nuclear weapon being smuggled through an American port by an unfriendly nation is much greater than us facing a nuclear launch from one of these countries simply because they don't want to have a return address for fear of a severe response. But instead of allocating more resources toward port security, Congress increased funding for an East Coast missile defense system most experts have described as being wasteful and has cut critical port security programs. The Port Security Grant Program has been cut by 75% since 2009, and the Coast Guard saw a $300 million cut in the latest Homeland Security Appropriations Bill from its 2013 enacted level. You've touched on this a little bit. Just again, for this committee and all those who are listening, what are the consequences, not just to our ports, but to our country and possibly to the global economy, if we fail to adequately address our nation's port security? Just want to hear it one more time.
Well, as I put in, the consequences could be severe if, in fact, you have someone, and it's not just a nation with nuclear weapons like an Iran or North Korea, a violent extremist group, that could smuggle one in that they got because we didn't control nuclear proliferation. The consequences to the country would be severe, and then everybody would be saying, well, gee, why didn't you do anything about port security? And our point, and we've been doing this, since 2004, says, look, you just tell us how much money you're willing to spend on national security, okay? It was higher, and then after sequestration might be lower. You can't buy perfect security, but let's do some cost-benefit analysis to make sure that we, get the most bang for whatever buck we're going to spend. And I understand people are concerned they want East Coast missile sites. Well, the head of the Strategic Command is saying, well, we don't need them. Well, if you're going to put money into that, why don't you, instead of putting it into that, put it more into port security? I mean, that's the type of thing that we're trying to do. And again, because the Coast Guard itself, doesn't come up. They don't have a political spokesman like Secretary Panetta saying, oh, my goodness, you have sequestration, we'll be back to where we were in 1916. Nobody pays attention, to that. They need someone to get out and make the point that you are. I mean, somebody like a Secretary Panetta or something that can say, look, ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you, because you've cut this by this amount, which you just mentioned, this is what you're risking. Then I think they would get more political support for it. But and my association with them over the years, they don't do that. It's always, we can do more with less. Well, I told them when I used to teach there, that's what you're going to get, okay? And you've got to be, more dramatic about it. And so I think that's what I would urge them to do. And again, it's not just the Congress, the administration should do that before they send their budget up. Even if you don't have a National Security Committee, there should be OMB or somebody should be looking at those things together, much like we look at the, the 4 military services together.
Well, thank you. And I know we're always looking at how to fund things and trying to find extra or dedicated revenue stream. One of the things that, Mr. Chairman, that I've suggested, and something I think we could at least look at, is the customs money, customs fees that comes into the customs districts. It is based on containers, and because it's about commerce. But I would argue that every container that comes into our ports certainly represents commerce, but they also represent risk. They represent risk to security. They represent risk to our environment. They represent risk to the infrastructure, whether it's the terminals and the wharfs or the highways and the bridges when they're being carried to the final destination. We've been using that money, obviously, for other things, just like we've been using the harbor maintenance tax for other purposes. But I think we ought to look at where this money is actually coming in to our ports, why it's being collected, and whether or not we might look at trying to redirect some of those funds back to the ports where they're collected for the purpose of securing and certainly maintaining the infrastructure for our national security. I yield back my time. Thank you.
I thank the gentlelady, and I would also I would throw in there that it's probably, if you're checking cargo on American soil, it's probably too late. You have to have this cargo checked at its ports as they leave port of origin to come to the United States. If there are no further questions, does the gentlelady have any further questions? Then I thank the witnesses for their testimony and the members for their participation, and the subcommittee stands adjourned.